Happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Toro Talk here on KDHR.net. I hope you've been great. It's been a long time since we last spoke, but there's been a lot of things going on in the media that we're going to be talking about next week. This week, though, here's an interview that I have been promising to you, and it is finally here. I'm very excited to have in studio my guest, Dr. Jason Whitehead, who is a graduate of the University of Southern California and Director of Legal Studies at California State University, Long Beach, where he is also professor in the Political Science Department. Dr. Whitehead's book, released last year by Baylor University Press, is entitled Judging Judges: Values and the Rule of Law. Within the pages of this wonderfully intriguing and accessible law book, Dr. Whitehead works to outline the personal and professional values instilled in the arbiters of justice. Along with his own analyses, Dr. Whitehead expertly weaves in the stories of 24 judges from the multiple levels of the state and federal courts. In their own words, from interviews conducted with them by Dr. Whitehead, these judges share their personal experiences and mindsets during deliberations, as well as their own judicial values and how those values affect their opinions. What transpires is a book that provides a fascinating glimpse into the minds of judges and how their minds and values evolved, or in a few cases did not evolve over time. From the earliest dawns of law school days to the twilight years spent on the bench, all areas are explored and detailed. And from all of this book forwards the argument that once we attempt to understand how judicial values are shaped and guarded and used, we can more readily provide a fair judgment of judges. If we are to judge our judges, then we must first learn how they judge, and Judging Judges provides you with that essential information. And with that, I'd like to welcome to Toro Talk Dr. Jason Whitehead. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. Very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, I'm very glad you are here. So let's get right into it. First, a little bit about you. What are your experiences with the law?
Well, after I graduated from college, I went right to law school. After that, I went to Willamette University up in Salem, Oregon. That was back in the late 90s. Feels like so long ago now. And I graduated from law school and then passed the bar exam. And then I clerked for part of actually my initial experience with judges. I clerked for a panel of judges on the Oregon Court of Appeals.
Okay.
And then after that, came back home to Southern California and was a staff attorney at the U.S. District Court in downtown Los Angeles, where I helped federal court judges decide mostly habeas corpus cases involving appeals from criminal defendants who are appealing from state court into federal court. So I had a lot of experience at that point with several different judges that I'd worked with, and I'd made a lot of contacts with judges.
Right.
And then at that point, I went back to graduate school and got my PhD, but it was specifically in public law. And so I have both the law degree and then the legal experience, and then all of the graduate training in constitutional law, legal theory, judicial decision-making is something I studied pretty heavily as a graduate student.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
So you get to add quite a few letters after your name when you sign something, JD, MD.
Yeah, I try not to add them all. It starts to become alphabet soup after a while. But, it was really, for me, getting the degrees it was not something I could have avoided because I just loved the subject so much.
Right.
That's what I always tell people that are thinking about going to graduate school is go if you have to. If it's something it's part of who you are.
You have that passion.
Yeah, the passion for it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. So how did those experiences inspire you to write this book? It seems from your intro, this has been a long time coming, this book.
It has been. I think really in many ways, the first judges that I worked for on the Oregon Court of Appeals, and even before that, I was working for the Oregon Department of Justice, helping write some briefs for the Ninth Circuit and various other courts. And from the very beginning, even before I went to law school, I think I had this view in mind of what a good judge was, and I wanted to study the process of judging. Even I think that was one of my motivations for wanting to go to law school. So I think all the way back from probably my civics course that I took, my AP government course in high school, probably my first introduction to the judicial process. It happened to be a moment. It was 1980. 86, 87. Someone will correct me out there if I'm wrong. It's somewhere in there when Judge Robert Bork was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. Yeah. And he was rejected by the Democratic-controlled Senate, including Senator Joe Biden, who was at that time on the Judiciary Committee. And that was sort of, we watched it every day in class, watched the confirmation hearings, and followed the political controversy. And that was really my first sort of eye-opening experience into how important judging is and how controversial the issue can become.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Wow, that's actually a really amazing moment to sit there and be able to sit there and watch that in the class. What a teacher that had foresight to allow that. Yeah. That's great. So now when you how did this book come about? How long did it take you to write this book, first of all?
This actually was the research itself, the underlying research was the dissertation that I did to get my PhD at USC. So that research started probably, I want to say, around 2001, 2002, just in terms of the secondary research looking at literature on judges. But in terms of the interviews themselves from 2003, 2004, all the way through 2007, and then writing the manuscript. I had a dissertation manuscript, but that's very different than a book.
Right.
And so then finally the book manuscript finished in 2009, I believe. So.
Wow. Well, speaking of the interviews, how hard was it to get 24 judges to sit down with you and be comfortable in revealing that their thought processes and their judicial philosophies? Because some of the things that they say in the book can be quite shocking, to say the least.
Sure. Yeah, part of the struggle is when you're doing ethnographic research, which is sort of a subspecies of when you're doing these informal interviews, is getting the judge getting any of your research subjects to understand that you are maintaining confidentiality. And that's a big deal for judges, especially who are public figures, right? Yeah. Who obviously there could be political ramifications of people knowing, that judges, although many of them, I was going to complete that thought, of judges saying things that might be negative, that might reflect negatively on them. Although I found that many of them, I can't put a number on this right now, but many of them told me it wouldn't matter to me if I was saying this to you or if I was saying this, on a radio show or on a television show, especially some of the ones that are identified in the final chapter, which are in some ways the most extreme of the judges. Many of them were quite open about it to anyone who would ask. But to answer your question more directly, it was a promise of confidentiality, which is backed up by the university research protocol. There's laws governing the protection of human subjects, but also I think making personal contacts with judges and lawyers and law professors that were friends of mine who would make personal introductions. So there was some sense of credibility. I wasn't just some random researcher getting in touch with them. So building networks over time, it's the only way I think in which to access this. This is really the most secretive process. Judging is the most secretive political process in the country. It operates behind closed doors for the most part, the deliberations of judges. So,
right.
So really, you have to know someone to sort of be able to become friends with judges. And I had a lot of friends already that were judges.
Right, yeah. So establishing those connections. So all the students out there who are listening, it is vital that you establish and maintain those connections from an early point in your career, right?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, have any of the judges whose words you shared in the book contacted you maybe in shock after seeing their words in text? Because it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to see it.
Right.
What has been the overall response?
Yeah, so not yet. I haven't had any judges that I interviewed get in touch with me negatively or positively about it. And mainly, I think I'm not sure how to account for that. I think part of it is judges have a lot on their plate. They're not necessarily paying much attention to some book that an academic from a California State University writes. However, I also think that there are a number of ways I tried to hide the identities of judges beyond confidentiality, and then a combination of that and the fact that, as I say, some of the judges were fine, even saying things publicly, so it wasn't an issue for them. But no, I haven't yet. We'll see what happens if and when the book becomes more popular. That could become something that might happen. I've certainly thought about it, but
well, who knows? Maybe in a week from now,
right?
Because of this radio
because of the show, right? That's exactly right.
Yeah. And what has been the response from your colleagues and students about this book? Have your students read the book? Or are they?
Yes, some have. I haven't assigned it just because I have this personal, I'm not sure, qualm against assigning a book that I wrote, but certainly my students knew I was in the process of writing it and that it came out, and so many did purchase it. And I've had individual conversations with students about it. It's hard with students because they always want to, they certainly want to tell me it's a good book. They have all kinds of reasons, why they would want to say that. But I do have other friends who have read it, colleagues in different universities, some of whom I went to graduate school with who read the book, and others. And it's been an interesting process of getting reactions. When you write something, you're not quite sure what the reaction's going to be. You have your own set of expectations for your work. So it's been very gratifying to hear. One of my colleagues who teaches up in the Northwest read the manuscript, and he said that he thought it was actually very moving. And it wasn't a word I would use to describe a book on judges, but he thought it had a sort of moral arc to it, and a sort of a sense of the personal element of judging, which he'd been trying to capture as he taught about judges. So it's been very nice. And then one of my colleagues from graduate school actually assigned it to her graduate seminar just this past semester, I think this semester, in fact. And she said the students were really digging into the details of the interviews and the things the judges were saying. So that was really fun to hear about.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Well, let's before we get into the actual meat of it, there's some definitions that we need to work through so that our audience knows when we refer to them what we're talking about. So let's first start off with the rule of law, the phrase of the rule of law. What are some of the challenges that come from an ambiguous definition of the rule of law?
Yeah, that's something I spend an entire chapter, as you know, in the book. Chapter 2 deals with the definition of the rule of law. One of the challenges of having such an ambiguous definition, which we tend to use the rule of law as a kind of catch-all phrase for situations that we either agree with or don't agree with, without really defining what we mean. We'll criticize judges for violating the rule of law. We'll support judges for upholding the rule of law. But one of the things that happens as a result of that opportunistic use of the phrase rule of law is it loses. It really was meant to have some concrete, definite, to do some work in a liberal democratic society, do some heavy lifting for us. And it has become a kind of just a catchphrase. So one of the things that happens is in political battles over confirmations of judges, people will throw the term around, even when judges are confirmed and they sit on a case and something is decided by a judge or by a court, more accurately, that is controversial. People will the word will come up a lot, the phrase will come up a lot as a kind of criticism or as a kind of praise. But we no longer have a sense, I don't think, anymore of what is the real value of living under a set of laws as opposed to the alternative. As opposed to living under the rule of bullets, for example, or as opposed to living under the rule of an autocrat, for example. So there's this great phrase in the work of John Adams, which eventually makes its way into a famous Supreme Court case you've probably studied, Marbury versus Madison, right?
Lots of time on that one.
The rule of law and not of men. So it's not. I think it's nice to contrast it with the alternative. The alternative being the rule of not just men, obviously, but the rule of human beings. And obviously humans are interpreting law. That's what the book is all about. But there's a sense in which they're interpreting something that is external to themselves. And there is something gained in a liberal democratic society, in any society, when you have people that are not simply ruling based on their own passions and based on their own interests, but they're trying their best. They don't always succeed, but they're trying their best to rule consistently with the law as they understand it. So what's lost, I think, is that dimension. We tend to think of judging as simply a political process like every other political process in the country. There's nothing wrong with politics, but when we talk about judges, we're talking about a different kind of politics. It's more limited, more channeled through the lens of the language that judges are bound by. They're supposed to be bound by it.
Right, and politics definitely does have a great influence on the selection of judges, specifically when it comes to the confirmations by the Senate. I mean, I think it was the last unanimous confirmation was Justice Scalia, and ever since then, it's been slowly, you see more and more dissent from the other party.
I always think about that and wonder at Justice Scalia of all people that
Right.
that would be such consensus. But I do think it speaks to the time in which that confirmation happened. It's become, I think, since the Bork nomination, really.
Right.
Now, you can look back in history and see other nominations that were controversial. So in some ways, we had a kind of lull in that fighting. But certainly in the contemporary era, since the mid-1980s, really, it's become increasingly controversial to the point where, you have filibusters being...
Right.
Now they just ended the use of the filibuster a couple of years ago with regard to judicial nominations, but that's how intense the fighting can be.
Yeah, definitely. So two phrases that come up are inside out and outside in views. Can you explain each of those?
So these are my attempts to capture, obviously in a simplistic way, but trying to capture two different ways of looking at the rule of law. I'll start with the outside-in view because that's the more traditional view, is that the rule of law really is about the law, which I said before is external to the judges, but the laws that the judges themselves are bound in some sort of almost slavish, mechanical way to the laws, so that the law almost acts as a kind of prison house within which the judge exists, so the judge cannot operate outside of the language of the law itself. And we all know, I think, at least in the modern era, that is not exactly how it works. That judges have to interpret language, and language is inherently a social thing that it can be interpreted. Words can be interpreted in various ways. Right. So the outside-in view it has the goal of trying to limit judges to the language of the law, but precisely that limit, because it is language, it opens the process up to subjectivity.
Right.
So the outside-in view is the traditional view of the rule of law, and the reason why I think the rule of law has come to be seen as a caricature of itself, because that's obviously not true. Judges are not bound in that external way by the rules, by the text of the law. And so if that obvious sense of the rule of law is not true, people go to the opposite extreme and say, well, the rule of law must not mean anything. There's no sense in which judges are bound by law, and I think that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I have no idea where that expression comes from. I use it all the time, but I'll have to look that up. But the pendulum swings back to the other end where it's all political then, if the judges aren't bound by the text of the law. So the inside-out view is my way of trying to focus on the subjective values that inform a judge's interpretation of the law. So the argument is that the rule of law can still prevail as long as judges have the right character, the right values, as long as they are oriented towards what I refer to in the book as the norm of fidelity to law, which is not necessarily that in every case they're going to follow the letter of the law. We'll talk about different judges and how they approach the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. But it's more that the judge has this inner orientation that's really the product of their whole life experience, that the law is the master. And my job is to try to figure out how to serve that master in the most faithful way possible, but also understanding there are different ways of interpreting the law. And so trying to make the best reasonable, good faith interpretation of the available law as is possible under the circumstances. So inside out in the sense that it comes from the internal values of the judge rather than from the external text by which the judge is bound.
Right. Oh, and you know what? I actually, now that you're saying that, I have a quote that I pulled up just to see if this came up. But it's a quote by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and it goes, quote, "I can and do aspire to be greater than the sum total of my experiences, but I accept my limitations. I willingly accept that we who judge must not deny the differences resulting from experience and heritage, but attempt, as the Supreme Court suggests, continuously to judge when those opinions, those sympathies, and those prejudices are appropriate." End quote.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a huge battle at the time Sotomayor was, I'm not sure when that quote is from, but there was a huge battle.
I wasn't sure if this was the actual quote.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
At the time that caused all that controversy.
It sounds like something that's a follow-up to it.
Yeah, I think it might be because
there was, I guess, let me see, I think it was President Obama who started the controversy when he nominated her by saying that one of the reasons he was nominating her was because she had this particular life experience, because she because she is a minority, and because she had grown up in a certain situation in a certain place where certain socioeconomic factors were affected her in various ways. So he talked about the role of empathy in the judicial process. And that
Right.
started, especially
That's
conservatives, really attacking the nomination and attacking Obama himself for arguing that the judge should allow anything besides the law itself to affect the process, especially the subjective sense of empathy of a judge. And the idea was judges should not care about the positions that that the petitioner or the respondent is in, socioeconomically, racially, anything else. They should care about how the law applies to the facts of that individual case. And so that is another battle over the rule of law.
Yeah, that's something that's very much discussed throughout the chapters of this book. That pull and push between which side should judges be on, right?
Yes, right. Although, let me say one more thing. That actually is what she said about experience in that quotation. Does try to balance those two things in a way that sounds very much like what I argue a good faith judge should do.
Right,
acknowledging
exactly.
that it affects you, but then trying to figure out in what way is it appropriate to the circumstance for it to affect you.
Unlike a rogue judge or the cynical judge.
Yeah, but we're getting
ahead of ourselves there.
Yeah.
I'm going to read something from the text, actually, and it deals with this exactly. The views, quote, the views of judges, just like the views of other political and legal actors, are part of a complex and dynamic interaction between the individual and society. Consequently, focusing on judicial values requires attention to how judicial attitudes about law are shaped by community norms, expectations, and practices, close quote. Dr. Whitehead, are courts really that beholden to the wills of the public, say like a politician would be?
No, I don't think so, although it depends on the judge and it depends on the court, obviously. For example, state courts, in California at least, state judges are elected by the people. And reelected, and so there is a sense in which they might be more sensitive to public wishes than federal judges who are not. Although the point of that statement that you just quoted is less about judges and their interaction with public opinion at any given moment, and more about the way in which judges are reacting to a whole lifetime of their own experiences with community. And when I speak about community, I'm speaking not just about their upbringing, although that certainly plays a role, but their specifically legal experiences in, for example, in law school as lawyers, among other judges once they become judges, the interaction, those kinds of community interactions certainly shape a judge's view. So it's less about public opinion, I think, and more about the estimation of other professionals within the practice of judging.
I see.
And within the larger practice of law.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay.
But also, I would say this, the social element, the wider social element is relevant because we have expectations about what judges ought to be and how judges ought to act. And I do think that it's relevant for judges, it's appropriate for judges to take that into account at a certain level. That there is this expectation that you should be impartial, that you should try to be impartial, that you should try to be as neutral as you can, that you should try, as Sotomayor says, to figure out when your prior experiences are appropriate and when they're not. But that assumes that there is this expectation, this societal expectation that is legitimate, that judges need to be confined. They need to confine their personal and political and social and other preferences within a fairly narrow realm. So there's a sense in which that general expectation does bleed into the judicial world.
Yeah, and you mentioned on that, there was actually an interesting line where you pointed out something that I was aware of, but I hadn't actually thought about. So I kind of had an epiphany moment. I was like, oh, yeah, that's completely true. Where we have this weird, let's say, public juxtaposition, I would say, this split where we expect them to be objective, but then we also expect them to, I'm trying to remember what the line was. We expect them to be objective, but we take issue when that objectivism does not align with our own personal feelings.
Right. Especially when we're dealing with politically controversial issues. It seems like whenever the Supreme Court's going to decide a same-sex marriage case, probably this coming or next month, actually. When that happens, my prediction will be the people that agree with the decision will say this is a vindication of the rule of law. This is judges just simply objectively following the rules that exist, even though it's not even possible to follow objectively a phrase like the Equal Protection Clause, which says exactly that there must be equal protection. Right? There's very little direction that gives to judges. On the other hand, people will criticize the decision, if they're on the other side, and will say the judges didn't follow the objective view of the rule of law. But so how can you have it both ways? If it was a different result, people would actually switch around and say, oh, no, this is a vindication of the objective rule of law.
Right. Part
of the problem is the law is, in some cases, especially on issues that are fairly controversial as this one is, the law is fairly ambiguous, which again goes back to this outside-in view. There's no way in which the outside-in view really captures the complexity of the rule of law. And so really, there is this kind of opportunism, and it leaves open a lot of hypocritical comments where people in one context will say, yes, the law should prevail objectively. In other contexts will say, no, it doesn't have to always. So you get all this back and forth because we don't have a better definition of what the rule of law is all about. Then it becomes political opportunism.
Right. And I'd like to say that I particularly enjoyed your use of imagery on this line, quote, abstract legal concepts are not self-interpreting. Indeed, legal concepts are cold and lifeless until judges breathe life into them by using them to decide actual controversies, close quote. I thought that I really enjoyed reading that line a few times and meditating on that one, because the more I thought of it, the more I realized that the imparting of the breath from the judge is two-part. It doesn't just breathe life into it, but it also transfers life to the lifeless text. It transfers a part of the judge into the law. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it exactly in those terms, but I think that is very consistent with what I'm writing about in the book, that there is a kind of personal, subjective dimension. And when I say subjective, I just mean it involves elements beyond the objective text. It involves elements of the judge's personality and values. And a part of the judge, I think that's right, a part of the judge is left in every decision. There's no way to avoid that.
Right.
On the other hand, what part of the judge is in the decision? Is it the part of the judge that prefers one political party over another? Is it the part of the judge that doesn't care for a particular social group and therefore decides a case against them? I would argue that would be illegitimate under a rule of law regime. On the other hand, even for judges to disagree about issues like same-sex marriage and other things, they're going to bring, and this is Sotomayor again, right? They're going to bring the personal way in which they approach those issues into that decision. There's no way of avoiding it. And I think there's a kind of life in the sense of the passion that judges bring to a case, but also the rigor and the training that an individual judge has, the experiences they might have had on a prior court or as attorneys, are certainly going to affect in a positive sense, I would argue, the way that they interpret the law. And how could it not be so?
And before we get into the meat of text, I have one more last question for you. Since we hinted on it earlier about the split when it comes to objectivism and how some people will take one side and the other, and the converse can be true if the situation goes their way. Why does a segment of the population aptly prefer that judges that see law as stone, that would be like the textualist argument, as opposed to something organic, because there is that split? Can you just comment on that real quick so people can understand the two camps, if you will, of textualists versus the living document? Sorry, it's a very open-ended question.
That's a good question. It's a more sociological question that I would have to do, much wider research but it would be a good question to investigate. My sense of it is that there is a fear of too much dynamism, right? A fear that judges will, because they're human beings, and this goes all the way back to the founding, this fear that judges will run roughshod over the text that has been enacted by duly constituted authorities, especially in a democratic system. So there's a number of authors. I would go back to an author like Alexander Bickel, for example, who made the argument that when the court is overturning the wishes of elected majorities, which are instantiated in the text of a statute, the court is acting in a counter-majoritarian way. And so there needs to be some justification in a democracy for courts undermining the wishes of the people. There are sometimes when it's necessary, but Bickel at least argued that there needed to be the court needs to be sensitive to that as an issue. And I think part of the fear that he's identifying is exactly this fear that if the law is not set in stone, or if the law is too organic, in the sense that it's too dependent upon the subjective preferences of judges, that we'll wind up with a government of men and not of laws, the opposite of what the rule of law is supposed to be.
Okay.
So then that's really the balance: is how do you find the rule of law? How do you define the rule of law and live it out in such a way where you avoid both the extreme of the judge just simply being a servant of this text that actually has no meaning until the judge interprets it, versus the judge simply making a ruling that is in their own personal interest. There's got to be a middle ground.
Right, there has to be a middle ground. And I pulled this quote right here, and I wonder if it speaks to that. It was my interpretation of that, but it, quote, "Virtuous submission to legal authority requires judges to be both good tellers of the old story of the law and good authors of a new story." So I think that my understanding of that line, I think it hints at that. Well,
that's for perceptive listeners. You'll recognize a little bit of Ronald Dworkin in that quote, and it's exactly what I'm going for there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. You actually have 4 values that you speak on. The first one being the formalist value. So, what is a formalist value judge?
A judge informed by formalist values is a judge who is almost mechanical in their relationship to law, in the way that they see law as constraining on their decisions. So they try their best to simply read the text of the law, understand literally what the text of the law is saying, and they mean, when they talk about literal, meaning they will look the words up in a dictionary. They will examine the grammatical structure of the sentences of the Constitution or the statute or whatever law is being interpreted. And they will see their role as really simply giving a voice to that law, simply letting that law govern the process with very minimal input on their side. Now, as we said, that's not entirely possible, and most of the formalist judges will realize, they'll acknowledge that it's not entirely possible, but they would also say that there is a value in attempting to do that, in weeding out all of the personal elements, as many as you can find in your personality, and just letting the law speak for itself. Because the judge is the servant of the law, the judge is not its master. The judge should not be there to play games with the law, but simply to carry out the law.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So famous formalist judges would be Justice Scalia,
Justice, right.
Clarence Thomas,
right? Thomas even more so.
Yeah.
Right.
Was Robert Jackson?
Jackson, it depends on the case, depends on the issue. I mean, Jackson brought a lot of his personal experience from World War II into some of the post-World War II cases. He was the chief prosecutor for the U.S. in the Nuremberg tribunals. And I think you can see some of that bleeding. I don't think he would have acknowledged that perhaps, but yes, I think Jackson certainly was a great mentor for eventually Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Rehnquist was actually his clerk. And so in that sense, I think Rehnquist learned a lot of his formalism from Jackson. It's a question whether or not, how formalist Rehnquist was,
right?
Because in some cases that's a little bit questionable.
Right, he diverged from that, definitely.
But I would also say Frankfurter in some cases, Justice Frankfurter, especially in a case like Baker versus Carr, for example, or other cases.
I just read about Baker versus Carr, actually.
Right, where he's making this argument that the court needs to be really careful in those situations where it's going to override the wishes of a Democratic majority. Yeah.
What are how are these types of judges dangerous, or how are they beneficial to the courts? Because they can be in 2 parts.
Sure. Yeah, I do think that I argue in the book that formalist judging does have in many cases. In fact, I think I would probably say in most cases. If we're looking at judging at appellate, and I have to clarify here that we're talking here about appellate judges and not about trial court judges, but at the appellate level, something like 95% of cases, maybe less, maybe more, depending on who's calling the shots there, but I would say probably 90% at least of the cases decided overall by appellate courts in the United States are easy cases, are cases where there's clear law that applies very clearly to the facts of the case. There's really no question that the appellate judge should simply take the law and apply it to the facts of the case. So in that sense, for the majority of cases, formalism's a fine, and it's a fine value system to have, and it certainly upholds the rule of law in those cases. The problem becomes when you see the 10% as identical to that 90%. So it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. As a formalist, as a judge informed by formalist values, you tend to see what you look for, right? You tend to, if you're seeing that in 90% of the cases, then your tendency is to look at that extra 10% and say, well, everyone else thinks these are judgment calls, but I'm going to use the same methods I've been using in these other cases to decide these cases of really that have really polarized opinions about the interpretation of law. So you're right; it can go both ways.
Mm-hmm. And so, and that's what the next question was hinting on. It was actually that it's built in, as you were saying, in the appellate court. Definitely, it's 90% of the cases are easy because there's already case law established where they follow the rule of law. So it seems like it's built into the strata of the courts, and that this chapter really makes a point to note that the lower two levels more likely to adhere to a formalist application of law. Yeah,
it's hard to generalize with the data that I have because it's 24 judges, and it's not a big enough data sample to generalize from. It's also ethnographic, but yeah, I would say I think there's other research out there that does confirm that at the lower courts, district court level, in the federal system, and even at the mid-level court of appeals in some of the circuit courts, you're going to find more of a prevalence of formalism. Although, if you look at the Supreme Court, right, you identified a couple on the Supreme Court now. Alito would probably fall into that camp as well in some cases. So it's become an issue there as well. But I do think because the lower courts they have to take so many cases without any discretion. There are just certain criminal cases, for example, that have to be, if they're appealed, they have to be taken by that court. There's no discretion. And so when you don't have discretion and you have a lot of, especially criminal cases coming through, it's a lot easier to be a formalist, to sort of identify that as your primary means of adjudicating these cases. Whereas if you have a lot of discretion to decide which cases you're going to take, the Supreme Court's not going to take cases where there's no real controversy between the circuits about how to apply the law and how to interpret the law. So especially on the U.S. Supreme Court and on state Supreme Courts, which are I also deal with state Supreme Court justices in the book, you're much more likely to find judges who, because of the nature of the cases they're deciding, they've chosen already the cases that have this controversy built into them where the law is not enough simply to resolve it. So.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and read from the text once again. Quote, judges with formalist values tend to shy away from the grand heights of fairness or equity, preferring instead the solid ground of particular rules, end quote. Yeah. So they definitely do feel that it's not the duty of the court to prescribe fairness and equity. It's more so the duty of the court to ensure that those things are fairly applied and in keeping with the rules.
That's true. Although in context, I think this judge is making a point about fairness and equity as philosophical notions.
I see. Okay.
So, and he argues, in fact, he or she, I don't remember the gender of the judge, but argues that, in fact, the fairest thing to do, if we're going to talk about fairness, is for the judge simply to adhere to the text of the law, because then everybody gets the same treatment regardless of whether you happen to agree with their position or not. But it's true that when I talk about the grand heights of fairness and equity, they're thinking about the expectation that judges somehow will be sort of philosopher kings.
I see.
Will sort of examine these issues from a more vaunted position and be able to do justice between competing parties in that political sense. And so this judge is reacting against that, saying, it's not my job, that's not my role. My role is as a law interpreter.
So since they are such strictly adhere to the text, are judges that are formalists influenced at all by forces outside of the court? It's very minimal.
As an empirical matter, I think yes. But what I'm trying to do in the book is more phenomenological, to use a fancy term for it. It's
That's
more,
a good one.
trying to Let's try to fancy it up a little bit here. This is what academics do.
Throw in a good word like synecdoche too.
There you go. Just
spice it up.
In case you're ever on Jeopardy and you need to figure out these words. What I mean by that phenomenologically is simply following the lived experience of judges. So I'm not trying to determine if, in fact, the formalist judges are free of external influence. I'm trying to figure out from their perspective, what are they trying to accomplish and what do they see as being valuable in the process.
I see.
But I think it's undoubtedly true that if you studied many of these formalist judges, and I'm not saying this because I'm thinking of particular ones that I interviewed, but if you studied them, you would no doubt find that the way in which their formalism plays out in particular cases is affected by the way they grew up. It's affected by religious influence. It's affected by their experiences as a clerk for a particular judge or as a lawyer.
Right, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the good faith value judge. Since we're moving along. Timing wise, wow, we're. But what is a good faith value judge? How do they contrast from the formalist?
Good question. So, in contrast to a formalist who is more mechanical, a good faith judge feels free to engage in disagreement. So, good faith judges will disagree with one another about how to apply the law, and they'll understand that people are coming from different perspectives, and they get that. They're sophisticated enough to understand that. But at the same time, they feel a sense of fidelity to the law. So even if you have an ambiguous legal phrase like equal protection, they'll do their best to make sense of that phrase in light of its history, in light of the literal meaning of it, but also in light of the precedents that have been set for that. They'll do their best within the available legal materials to be faithful to the law, even if they realize in the end this is not a science. This is not math. This is a human judgment that's being made. So it's good faith in the sense that I'm acting as a faithful interpreter of law, even while I'm acknowledging that it doesn't completely decide the issue.
Okay, and so, and then going back to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she would fall into this camp, possibly?
Perhaps. I would have to, this is the thing about doing this sort of, I'd have to really interview. I'd love to. Justice Sotomayor, if you're listening, anytime, give me a call. I'd love to interview you.
And I'll give it an extra push. I am a fellow Puerto Rican Justice Sotomayor, and so she is a Puerto Rican. So now I'm really asking you as a fellow Puerto Rican to come talk to Dr. Whitehead.
Yeah, but she very well could be, and certainly the quotation that you read earlier does seem to fit into this mold, acknowledging that personal values matter, but at the same time saying they only matter to a certain point. The law is at some point the law has to be the final decision maker.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you any other ones offhand that you can think of? Just so I could go through and read it, and any of your students can too.
See, the tough thing about identifying individual judges is these are value systems, and some judges they have formalist values on some issues and good faith values on other issues.
Yeah,
so
you
it's
actually
tough.
speak on that too, on how some judges, specifically on Bush versus Gore, maybe they went a different route than past cases.
Right. That's a very strange situation, right, where you have liberals going in a direction on federalism that they had abhorred in previous cases, and you have conservatives coming up with this equal protection jurisprudence that they had rejected in prior cases. Yeah.
Okay. And actually, this is an interesting chapter for me because I was reading through it, and there was a lot. There was different tones. By the way, each chapter had a different tone completely.
Okay.
I don't know if that was purposely written into that, but the language was even a little bit different. In the chapter that dealt with formalism, there was a lot more technical terms, and it was a lot more rigid. And when it came to this chapter, it seemed a lot more collegial, like it was a discussion. And I thought that was actually quite nice.
I didn't intend to do that, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it actually happened that way, because when I was reading through the formalist chapter, I'm sitting there going, oh man, this is tough. This is when I started pulling out my Black's Law Dictionary and going, okay, I gotta look up that term. But then the next chapter, this good faith value, it felt like I was having a conversation with you. And that seems to be the theme of the good faith value judge. And if you can comment on that, a lot of the judges were talking about how they spend a lot of time speaking about the law and how to interpret and apply it to cases. Yeah,
the collegiality of an appellate court really has a role to play with good faith judges. Good faith judges are very open, typically, to discussing with other colleagues because they acknowledge that there are different interpretations. And so they want to hear from other colleagues about their interpretation, bounce ideas off of other colleagues so that they can then have a more informed view of how they should decide the case themselves. By contrast, many of the formalist judges, when I asked them questions about their views of other judges on their court, they were very crabby about it. Typically, they would just say, what do I care what these other judges think? I can read the law for myself. Or they would be suspicious of the motives of other judges. Oh, these other judges are cynical about the law, or they're rogue judges. They wouldn't use those phrases. Those are mine. But they're very suspicious of the political motivations of other judges, and they think they're the ones who are the paragons of virtue on the court. Whereas good faith judges tend to be more just open to the discussion and wanting to really have, I talk about the educative effect of those collegial discussions. Mm-hmm. It has a very Aristotelian feel to it. If you've studied Aristotle, you know about the way in which civic virtue emerges from citizens in the polis, in a well-constructed polis, who are deliberating about the public good. Mm-hmm. And there is that, you get that sense from good faith judges.
Okay, yeah. So I definitely I picked up a lot of respect in this chapter again from good faith value judges. Do you think this is we're getting ahead of ourselves because we haven't talked about the other two, but I feel like this is the judge that you feel that most judges should be. Is that correct in saying that?
I think so. I think this is probably for me the paragon of the rule of law. Because I don't think that formalism accurately portrays. I think formalism is too wedded to the outside-in view, and so the good faith judicial value system acknowledges the ambiguity and the sophisticated level of detail and thought and rigor that needs to go into legal interpretation, but at the same time acknowledges it's not just about me; it's about the law. So yeah, I do think, and obviously that's affected by my own experiences. With judges who are not in the book, but who I worked for, who just taught me a lot about what it means to be a good faith judge. There are just a lot of things that I learned about that. So.
And I like about this book is it has each chapter has subsections that are prevalent in each chapter. There's always the same. It talks about the influences, and then it goes to language.
Right.
Speaking on language, how does the interpretation of language differ between a formalist and a good faith value judge?
Yeah, formalists their use of language tends to be fairly mechanical in the sense that they are. It's not surprising that you saw a lot of technical terms because they tend to use a lot of technical terms. They tend to also use a lot of rules of interpretation that require an understanding of the specific placement of a word in the sentence or the meaning of a word. Whereas, and also the language that they use to get with one another and the language they used in the interviews with me, they're constantly using legal jargon, legal rhetoric to describe things, much less accessible. Whereas good faith judges are more, their language, at least to me and when I observe them with other judges, is much more, they sound more like human beings speaking to one another.
Yeah, no, definitely. I bet that's exactly when I picked up on that, because the first one with the formalist sounded very professorial.
Yes.
And the next one, it sounded like they're speaking to you as a colleague. As
we're all
opposed to
people.
Speaking, we're all people.
We can sit down and figure this out.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and get into it. Now, these are the fun ones.
So this is where the line is, right? Formalists and good faith judges, I argue, uphold the rule of law in different ways. Good faith judges, I think, in a better way, in a more sophisticated way. But now we have this hard line between the good faith judges and the cynical judges and the rogue judges, who I argue do not uphold the rule of law.
Right, yeah. And I noticed there was a notable tonal shift, specifically in these two chapters. I don't know if it was just because of the time of day I was reading it, but as I was reading this, everything got very dark and cloudy and pessimistic.
Okay.
But first of all, what is a cynical value judge and what is a rogue value judge?
Right. So a cynical judge, a cynical value, a cynical judicial value would be a value that informs the judge that really the law has no binding authority, or that the authority of law at least is questionable. Because the words are ambiguous, because the precedents are conflicting, because the original intent is either non-existent or hard to find, some cynical judges will simply throw up their hands and say, who knows? I have no idea what the law means. Mm-hmm. So all I can really do is fall back on my my personal experiences. Mm. And they're not going full bore and saying, that's all that matters. They're just saying, this is the situation I'm in. I've got to make the best of it. So cynical in the sense that they're skeptical of the fact that law could have any authority in a particular case. Whereas a rogue judge is embracing that that disloyalty to law. They're sort of almost, in some cases, gleefully embracing the fact that I have the freedom to do whatever the heck I want to do, and I'm going to do it. And no one can really, stop me. In some cases, in the federal court system, some of those judges, they were just really proud of the fact that this is what I do, and this is what I was put here to do, and I'm going to keep doing it. It's just an embrace of the personal agenda that judges might have.
And you have a little exchange between, I think it was a law clerk and a judge, and the law clerk was saying, the judge was saying, well, do you like the end result of the case? And he was sitting there saying, the law clerk saying, no. And then the judge responds by saying, well, then why are you doing it that way?
Right. This was actually a judge I interviewed who was telling me about his own experience as a clerk with the judge that he clerked for, right? Yeah, that was the conversation. So why go through this formal or even good faith process of trying to figure out what the law means? Instead, start with the result. Mm-hmm. Figure out who you think should prevail in the case and work your way backward from there. Or think about what policy you think should prevail in the case and work your way backward from there to figure out how to use the law to convince others on the court or even in the public or in the bar to go along with the decision that you've already made on other grounds.
Well, then in that case, I mean, is the rogue judge really what is an activist wearing robes on a soapbox, which happens to be the bench?
Right. I think you could. The whole debate about judicial activism and judicial restraint can be mapped onto this. I try to do that in the final chapter a little bit. But I think it's less about we tend to think about an activist judge as a judge who is willing to overturn a statute, for example, or a judge who's willing to allow their personal views to come to bear. And I tend to think of it more as a value that the judge brings to the table. These judges, these rogue values, these judges informed by rogue values, are just more likely to feel like they are at the center of the universe. I don't mean that in a personal. Some of them are probably very warm and altruistic, generous people in their private lives, but they feel like when they put on those robes, it's really about my judgment that matters. That's really the thing that matters. So there's a sense in which that is an activist position, but I think the term judicial activism has a kind of maybe an unhelpful ambiguity to it that because it doesn't really get at the values behind the activism.
Okay, so then would it be more fair to say that these judges are maybe inconsistent with their interpretation because they seem to apply the law when it's in, I would say, their view, the best in society's interest, for the best of society's interest, right?
It might be inconsistent. I think in some cases you'll find some rogue judges that are relatively consistent, but the consistency is brought about because of their political ideology or because of their personal likes and dislikes, and it's relatively straightforward. But the thing is, I think I even use the term narcissism in that chapter to describe this sense of. One of the judges told me, I think it may have been the same judge we were just talking about with the experience with as a law clerk. He said, it's my job to figure out who's right in the case, and then to use the law to try to help other people, other judges on the court, to convince them that I'm right. And sooner or later, they'll all come around to the position. They'll realize that I'm actually right about this. Right. So there's a sense in which it's really driven by.
Yeah, and in stark contrast to one of the judges who said, if I'm trying to remember the quote here, he said something along the lines if I think I'm right and I'm trying to convince the other judges and I'm not able to, then maybe I'm not.
Yes.
Right. So stark contrast with that.
That's a good faith way to look at it. And they're polar opposites in that sense, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Funny enough, when I was reading this, I don't know if you're a Harry Potter fan.
Not so much. I have a wife who's read some of the Harry Potter novels, and she tells me some things, but I'm not
yeah. Funny enough, these four types of judges align perfectly with four houses in Harry Potter.
Okay.
Where Ravenclaw, and this is for all the students out there then that I'm speaking to, Ravenclaw adheres strictly to the rules of law, just as they do in the books in Hogwarts. Hufflepuff has the good value, and Gryffindor seems to go outside of the lines as a cynical, and Slytherin, the bad guys in the book, are the rogue ones.
Oh my goodness!
It actually, and I was sitting there and I was like, "Am I reading this right?" I was reading through the chapters and I'm like, "Nah, it lines up perfectly."
Wow.
Funny enough.
There's a nice follow-up project, I think.
Yeah, you could do the exactly how it applies.
And this would be great to be able to explain judicial values to kids, right?
Yeah, that's actually a perfect way of doing it.
College students.
Anyone who's read the Harry Potter books will completely see how that lines up perfectly.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, no problem. And so actually running out of time.
Yeah.
And so, you know what? I'm not gonna even get to this last question, but what are your thoughts on any kind of conclusion on what we're talking about? I'm just gonna leave it open to you, and then we'll get into your song choice, of course.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I think the main thing I wanted to get across in the book is that the rule of law is not just about the law. It's actually about, obviously, it's about values, right? But not just about the values of judges. It's about the values that we have as members of society. What are we expecting from our judges? And if we expect judges that are political, we'll get judges that are political. Mm-hmm. If we expect a judicial confirmation process and a selection process to be really a battle over ideology, then that's pretty much what we'll get. So we've tended to kind of lower our expectations as a society for what counts for being a good judge and what counts for a good judicial decision. And I think we all have a stake in maybe raising those expectations back up, but it's difficult. It's hard work to figure out where a judge is coming from, because you'd have to go into their background in a much more thorough sense than we actually do today. But I also think that there's value in this traditional idea of the rule of law, even if it's a kind of non-traditional take on the rule of law, which I think it is in some ways. There is still, I want to kind of uphold this. I want to sort of polish off this old idea of the rule of law and hold it up to a modern audience and say, our forebears actually knew something when they talked about this ideal of the rule of law. They were shooting for something that's a valid thing to be shooting for, that's actually a good goal for a society to have. And I think we all lose something in the process when the rule of law just becomes a cheap way to score political points. Mm-hmm. So that's really the main goal of the book, is try to get people interested again in this ancient ideal and to see the connection to judges and to be excited about the process of evaluating judges within that framework.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Judging Judges, Values in the Rule of Law by Dr. Jason Whitehead is available online through Amazon, I believe.
Amazon, or you can go to Baylor University Press, bupress.com, and
perfect.
Order it that way. Right?
All right. And let's get into actually the song choice of the week that you pulled up. It's a Bob Dylan song.
Yes.
What does this song mean to you?
Yes. So this is It's All Right, Mom, Only Bleeding, which is probably my favorite Bob. It's hard to pick a favorite Bob Dylan song, but part of the reason why I like the song is that he's railing against the establishment, against this conformist society, but at the same time he's railing. You can interpret it as being a kind of anti-establishment song as well. So it's my favorite lines in the song have to do with that. It's that one line where he says something like that it is you have to get it in your mind and not let go of the fact that it is not he or she or it that you belong to. Mm-hmm. And it always speaks to me as this sort of, you are in possession of your own soul. Mm-hmm. You hold, as one of my favorite saints, St. Thomas More says, you hold your soul in your hands like water. And if you open your fingers, you don't want to let go of it. And I think this song really captures for me a sense of that.
Well, with that, I thank you very much for coming in, Dr. Whitehead. It's been a true pleasure. Toro Talk returns next week. Make sure to check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/ToroTalk.